Our debate today is called Looking the Part, 21st Century Gender Identity, and today we'll be exploring what it means to be male or female and everything that lies in between and beyond that rigid gender binary. Transgender has blown apart the concept that male and female are two discrete identities. Can we say that anything or anyone is uniquely female, or does it really matter? Over the years, my own gender expression has traversed the spectrum, and yet a core issue for me has been the right to love another woman and be recognized as a lesbian. What has our gender or gender expression got to do with our sexuality? That's the question that a new generation of queers is asking. Today, for many, it's about who you are. Identity is distinct from sexual orientation. A new category, genderqueer, has grown popular amongst young people. But is this a privileged, or some might say unscientific critique that doesn't make sense beyond the student campus? Well, here to discuss this and other ideas are feminist author and activist Naomi Wolf, queer filmmaker Campbell X, equality campaigner, writer and broadcaster Paris Lees, and genderqueer blogger Peter Piercy. But just before our panelists present their thoughts, allow me to introduce them properly. Naomi Wolf is an author and campaigner who's written 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Beauty Myth, The End of America, and Give Me Liberty. Also her recent book, Vagina, which we'll be drawing on today. She travels regularly to speak about gender equality, social justice, and was a co-founder of the Woodhull Institute for Ethical Leadership, an organization founded to train young women leaders. Her essays appear in esteemed publications throughout the world, including the Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, and the New York Times. She's currently working toward a doctorate in Victorian literature at Oxford University. Campbell X is an award-winning international filmmaker, curator, and writer-director of Stud Life, and an urban queer feature film which was screened throughout the world and recently won the coveted Independent Spirit Award. Honored by the Queer Black Cinema Festival in New York for her collected body of work, she has programmed film festivals for Black History Month, as well as programming the LLGFF here at the Southbank, and has curated exhibitions in London, Los Angeles, and New York. Paris Lees is editor of Meta, a groundbreaking digital publication devoted to gender. A commentator, TV and radio presenter, she also writes for a range of publications, including The Guardian, and I'm very pleased to say DIVA, and is also currently acting assistant editor of Gay Times magazine. Through her work with Transmedia Watch and Transmedia Action, she has opened dialogue with media outlets, including Channel 4 and Radio 1. And finally, Peter Piercy, a genderqueer activist and blogger. Peter is the founder and co-organizer of Transgender Queer London, a gender identity support and discussion group. She runs workshops and events on trans issues, and working towards a master's degree, he writes about gender, sexuality, feminism, and more at her blog, Queeriodical. So, without further ado, let me hand over to Naomi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank everyone who convened this, and it's actually exciting just to sit on a stage with the people who are creating all of these new possibilities for human expression and doing such important work. And of course, this is one of my heroes. I think that DIVA is one of the most exciting and important magazines in Britain, if not in among sort of English language magazines, including North America. And I urge all of you, if you're not familiar with it, to read it, support it, whatever your sense of your orientation. It's a fabulous, fabulous read and very steamy, beautiful pictures. So I guess what I want to say very briefly is that, the question, do gender binaries exist or matter, is one that both from my own experience growing up as a child at ground zero and a teenager of the sexual revolution, the gay and lesbian revolution in the Haight-Ashbury in the 70s, and also my recent studies in history and science have led me to categorically conclude that these are imaginary constructs. And I'll get to what I mean by that. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as biology. But I'll explain why my conviction is that there is no such thing as rigid male, rigid female, rigid heterosexual, rigid homosexual, that these categories are really invented. So let me back up a little with my personal experience of this. So I grew up in a time and place, and why I think that what what we're describing here as in terms of people's self-identification is so much more important than their social assignation or biological assignation, is that I watched this. I'm a pacer, and I really want to pace around. But if I pace around, you can't hear me, right? No, all right. I'll just dance behind the microphone. I witnessed as a child, growing up in the 60s and 70s in the center of the gay and lesbian revolution. And in some ways, our house was in the center of it because my mom was a graduate student, and her thesis and then her book was called The Lesbian Community. And it was one of the first pieces of research to explore the lesbian community and write about it. And so every night she was out at dyke bars. And, at my bat mitzvah, there was a club called Dykes on Bikes, and there they were, at a table, surrounded by all the little old ladies from the synagogue, with their, motorcycles parked outside, and they gave me this wonderful little kind of menstruation goddess figure, to empower me. And so my sense growing up was this was completely the way the world worked, right? I thought the whole world would be like this, and a world in which whatever anyone was valued. Of course, I had a rude awakening leaving San Francisco and leaving that kind of cradle of empowerment. But what I definitely saw with the gay and lesbian movement is that people who just a few years before, gay men and lesbians, and everyone in the rich spectrum of other sexual identities, a few years before, there was a culture of shame and silencing and vicious legislation, terrifying laws. By the way, there was a law when I was 13 that got initiated to kick gay and lesbian teachers out of our high school. And I remember how terrified some of the teachers were in that school. That was one of my first imprintings on the power of suppression of civil liberties through sexual identity to terrify people and intrude in their homes, intrude in their love lives. But I really witnessed these groups of people cross over from being in a position of defendedness, stigma, shame, silence, to this moment where they stopped running, right? And the counterculture became the dominant culture, and all of these publications and discourses started to say, we're not running anymore, we're gonna own this language, we're gonna reclaim words like queer and dyke that are used to silence and oppress us. We're gonna create power blocks. That was an amazing lesson, watching gay and lesbian communities organize. Many of you have seen the film Harvey Milk or read the biography, these great grassroots organizations. And very quickly, no matter what your fucked up biases as a political leader in San Francisco, you couldn't discriminate against gay men and lesbians because they would oust you in the next election. They were so well organized and so determined to make changes in the community. So it was an incredible lesson for me in the power of political revolution, but also what I clearly saw was that as these gay men and lesbians and people of all sexualities asserted their right to love and their right to their sexual identity, it wasn't just about sex, it wasn't just about who they were in bed with or the nature of their pleasure. It was clearly an integration of something larger and bigger about their whole selves, that coming out wasn't just coming out about who they wanted to sleep with, it was about an integration of spirit that affected everything else in their lives. And this was just a very big imprinting in my life. And so when I saw the transformational nature of the gay and lesbian revolution in the lives of people around me in San Francisco, that really led me to the work I've done ever since in sticking up for believing that, in my most recent book, women of any sexuality deserve to not have their, vaginas or their desire or their longing mocked, degraded, demeaned, and so on. that the right to sexual pleasure and sexual self-assertion is a human right that is on a spectrum of about dignity and autonomy, and not merely, not just about sexual pleasure. All right, so that's my personal story. And now what I want to say about history and science very briefly, the reason I believe these conceptual categories don't exist in addition to just witnessing such a multiplicity and diversity of people and orientations growing up in this fantastic, magical land that was San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, in which, by the way, I never knew a well-groomed heterosexual man until I went east to college, because in San Francisco, all the really beautifully groomed men were gay or bisexual, and so the poor straight guys in my high school couldn't signal their sexual orientation without looking really, really scruffy. So I didn't actually know heterosexual men bathed until I, got to college. But I also remember, and this was unusual, it was considered very déclassé to be just straight in my high school. You weren't anyone unless you were bisexual. So people who weren't actively bisexual pretended to be bisexual in order to be cooler. So it was definitely a rude awakening going east and finding that the whole world was not like this. Now, history. I looked back at the history, and I'm working at Oxford on histories of sexual identity, actually the construction of gay male identity in the Victorian period. And what's really, really interesting if you look back at history is how so much of what we take for granted as eternal in sexual identity was actually recently invented. For example, in the 19th century, many of you know, women friends engaged in all kinds of kissing, erotic behavior, sleeping in the same bed, passionate friendships and attachments, with all kinds of romantic and sexual implications and outcomes. But this was seen as completely socially acceptable for the most part because it was in a category of non-threatening, passionate female friendships. There's a great book called Surpassing the Love of Men that describes this. So there were all kinds of lesbian behavior going around, if that's what you want to call it, but it wasn't identified as a deviancy in the same way that it became identified once the law kind of caught up with codifying this behavior as negative or aberrant, which actually happened in the 1920s, fairly recently. The downside was also invisible. There wasn't any law about it because, as Queen Victoria famously said, women don't do that sort of thing. But the really interesting thing that you see in the 19th century is that gay men are being prosecuted with increasing penalization for increasing ranges of behavior, from sodomy to every kind of affection, even effeminacy, quote unquote, got criminalized by a statute. But lesbians are completely out of the legislative picture, almost entirely. It wasn't a social anxiety. Which gave women a lot of freedom in a weird way. If you go back further to the Middle Ages, my mentor at Yale, John Boswell, a very great historian who sadly died very young of AIDS, did an amazing book showing that passionate gay male friendships, what we would call gay male friendships, wrap it up, were very common in the Middle Ages, and that these only got identified as aberrant, deviant, vice, etc. in the 19th century. And then we can talk, I'll wrap it up, but we can talk in the Q&A about my the scientific findings, which convince me that while biology certainly exists, human variability is so variable that we're all on a spectrum. And I said last night that I want to get my XXY tested because I sometimes wonder if I've got that that extra testosterone thing that some women have. None of us is just one thing or another, and they're finding that even 4% of babies are born with indeterminate genitals, not neatly fitting any sexual category. Hooray, I would say. I think the more we embrace that natural variability and don't get hung up on rigid binaries, the better we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Jane, for organizing this panel. Thank you, Naomi. That was really interesting. I'm going to talk about the personal being political, as that was a call to arms in the second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s. So I'm going to use the personal as political. And I'm going to start with a Mother's Day dedication to my mother, who taught me about gender. And she always said, "We run things no run we." So I'll let that settle in for a little while. I can chat the patois, but I'm not going to do that today. So I'll be speaking mostly from the I. I'm hoping that what I say may resonate with some of you. If not, I can take comfort in Audre Lorde's words, which are, it is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And for those of you who are not familiar with her work, she's self-defined as a black, lesbian, mother, warrior, and poet. So when thinking about masculinity, femininity, gender, parents, and identity for this talk today, I was struck by the limitation of our language. The words we use lock us into a gender binary cage when people like me just want to fly high above it all and not kind of worry about it. So in preparing this talk, I looked up the definition of masculine, you know, on the interwebs, because that's where we look for things now, don't we? Don't really read a lot of books, sorry, Naomi. The first thing that came up was, I wanted to see how I measured up, and the first thing that came up was like a man. So I asked myself, am I like a man? Aggressive, I certainly am. Strong, I'm not really sure about that one. Unfeeling or stoic, definitely not. No shows of emotion, I'm Caribbean. What do you think? No flamboyance? Well, anybody who knows me knows that I'm flaming, all right? No hugging or even looking at other men. I look at men, studs, boys all the time, and I hug my stud AG bros. Must be interested in sports and physical or violent activity. Well, I have one big confession. I hated sports in school. I was always the last one chosen. I couldn't care less about the offside rule, don't give a fuck. I do watch World Cup, though, and it's just to look at the fashion. So that's me, you know. Then I looked up feminine. Like a woman, am I? Understanding, up to a point. Empathetic, tick. Sensitive, yeah. Submissive, definitely not. Gentle, yes. Modest, sometimes. Willowy was a word they used. I have no idea what that means. You can tell me. Pretty, well, it's a word I hate to be used to describe me. Okay, some of you are thinking, well, you know, Campbell's genderqueer, so these categories are really meaningless. But I then use it to apply to my mother and father, my sister and brother, and it was, you know, we came up with similar qualities. In 1851, Sojourner's Truth reminds us that the legal definition of the gender of woman didn't even always apply to black women. I don't know if some of you are familiar with her speech, but I'll read a portion of it. That man over there, I'm not going to do the accent, okay? So I'm going to read it in my voice. I'd love to do the accent, but nah. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best places everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? She gave this speech because there was the suffrage movement for women to be allowed the vote, and they were going to deny it to black women because they weren't actually women. So this made me realize how we're still frozen into a value system around gender definitions which are Eurocentric and racist. These definitions don't just uphold the notion of a binary gender, but the definitions themselves, masculine and feminine, are problematic. How many of us queers use masculine butch to refer to being capable and strong, and never femme to denote the same? Or when we say someone looks like a lesbian, to refer only to androgynous or AG women. So here I am, not a man, not a woman, but a human who loves and desires lesbian femmes. Most days, however, when I wake up, I don't think of myself as Campbell, the black filmmaker, Campbell, the black lesbian, Campbell, genderqueer, until I'm made to face it as I negotiate my way in the world of work on the street. As I interact with people, I operate on what I call the impermanence of privilege, and I want to kind of explore that a bit more. I think it's precarious, as I know it can be disrupted at any moment. I acknowledge that I have privilege because of my class and education, and also some shorter people remind me because of my height. We can talk about that. Being seen as a black man, which I'm very often sees as offers tenuous privileges, and it also includes assumptions that I might be a thug. My gender is always raced. I do not have the luxury of my race being an unmentioned, like people with white skins may experience in the Western world. And when I'm read as a stud or butch woman, then any male privilege I might have had plummets faster than the speed of sound. I can tell you, people are just like, whoa. Again, I refer to Audre Lorde. Only by learning to live in harmony with your contradictions can you keep it all afloat. Now, it was really great that you, Naomi, shared some personal stories, and I'm going to share some anecdotes about privilege versus non-privilege as I negotiate my way. Jane mentioned that I programmed the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival some years ago, and I was at the Southbank. I went into the women's toilets and I was shouted to get out by some lesbians. And I was really shocked and kind of upset by it because I thought, my fellow queers would see me. But I was invisible to them as a queer and hyper-visible as a black man. Black men are often feared as having the potential for sexual and violent threat, and in those women-only spaces, it was presumed I had invaded and therefore a threat. I know the gasp, the hold in the chest, the anger, the terror are all due to what has been projected onto black men's bodies and hence onto mine. At the dry cleaners I went to recently to get a suit cleaned, the guy listened and took notes very respectfully of how I wanted the suit to be cleaned. And as he admired the suit, he called me sir. I know the difference when I'm referred to as sir, and there's always a deferential tone from men and women. Madam never has the same referential treatment. Okay, I'm going to talk about, so in a way, my privilege vacillates between having privilege or not. But there's something that I think always gets put off the counter, and that's desire. And I wanted to talk about sex, but I'm being wound up by Jane.
Sorry.
So I'm going to have to ignore that because desire is desire is something that often gets knocked off when it comes to talking about gender. And there's one woman that I'm never invisible to, and that's the femme who loves studs or butches. And she reads my every layer of gender, and she will desire what she sees in me, the not a man. I'm skipping out bitch. She understands studs and femmes both pass as dominant oppressor demographics in different ways and at different times for diverse, misogynistic or racist reasons. We're different but equal, and we know that. So it's the last privilege that I really want to address, and it's the dominance of the masculine and the absence of self-defined lesbian femmes being asked to speak about gender. Being a self-defined lesbian femme is a gender choice. To ignore this is to use a white supremacist heteropatriarchal framework as a standard which we buck against when we LGBT think of gender non-conforming. Self-defined lesbian femmes do not conform to gender norms, and if we think they do, we ignore the disruptive nature of their desire, their rejection of dominant cultural expectations through attitude, thought, and resistance to compulsory heterosexual hardwiring. The preponderance of images of so-called lesbian femininity in dominant media, fashion, and porn, which is overwhelmingly performed by straight feminine women, corrupts our view of lesbian femmes and feminine lesbian and bisexual women in general. These images also erase lesbian femmes and feminine lesbians. If we as LGBT people also ignore lesbian femme voices in LGBT queer spaces, we are no better than those men who talk over women, effectively rendering them mute. And I'll wrap up now. The personal is political. So I conclude with a call to action where we take responsibility in our lives for our re-emancipation from gender malaise. Our actions will surely have a butterfly effect, which can only reverberate out and cause an actual revolution. I'm waiting for that. Power.
Thanks. Thanks, Campbell. Paris. Paris Lees, everyone.
I'm kind of tall, so I'm going to move that. Hi, thanks for having me, Jane, and thank you, Naomi and Campbell. I don't know how many gay men we've got in the audience, but I don't know if anybody reads my column for Gay Times, and if you don't, it's available online. But it's named after the Madonna song, What It Feels Like for a Girl. And truth told, I don't actually know what it feels like for a girl, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about what it feels like for me. One of my earliest memories was of being on a park near the estate where I lived, and I was on one of those metal things that spins around, and I still don't know what they're called, but they make you feel sick, right? We all know those. And I had my head in a girl's lap, and she was a big girl, so that could have been anything from 7 to 14 for me, because I was 4 at the time. And I remember feeling really nauseous because we were spinning round, and I was trying to explain to her that I was a girl, and she seemed to find this really funny. And there were some older boys there as well, and they seemed to find it really funny. But more than this, they seemed to think that I'd said something really naughty. Like, I was like, oh gosh, what has he said? He said something really bad. And I was like, oh gosh, have I said the wrong thing, And so began really a decade of me trying to explain to people that I was a girl, and them telling me, no, that's just not the case. That's not going to happen. And my family told me, you've got a boy's body, you've got a boy's bits, you're a boy, that's it, that's the end of it. And a huge source of disappointment and upset to me as a child was the thought that I wouldn't grow up to be a woman. And I always thought that that's what would happen. So it was very confusing for me, this huge social pressure, being told, this is what you've got to be. And me thinking, no, that's not right. There's been this huge mistake. I tried to be a boy for a bit, but as you can probably tell, it wasn't entirely successful. I hated anything to do with masculinity or that was associated with masculinity. And my father sent me to football classes, to boxing lessons, and I just hated all of these things, hated everything. And obviously, I now know that, women do boxing and women do football and all that kind of thing. But nevertheless, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was drawn to the feminine and just didn't really want to be with the boys, wanted to hang around with the girls. So after trying to conform for a little bit, when I got to about 14 and you get to that kind of, self-expressive kind of stage, I was very androgynous. But I also became more boyish, and I attribute this to the effects of testosterone upon my brain, because, it does have an effect on the body, and it does make the brain grow in different shapes. It makes the body grow in different shapes. And I certainly don't think that hormones are the be-all and end-all of gender. But if I think of my mother, for example, if she had the levels of testosterone that I had as a teenager running through her body for 6 years, do I think that would have an effect on her? I think it would, actually. And I think that it had an effect on me. But nevertheless, I still couldn't shake this feeling that, something just wasn't right. I didn't feel like a man. And even though I felt quite comfortable indulging my feminine side when I felt safe, I wouldn't necessarily go out in the daytime, looking androgynous, but I would at nighttime, or I might be high femme. I still felt I needed more. It wasn't that I couldn't express myself, but it wasn't just about expression. And I think that's when I realised as a child, for me, being a woman, being a girl, was about what you could do. It was about, I can play with these dollies, or, I can have long hair and I can have Polly Pocket, and so on, so on. And then I realised that, as a teenager that, yeah, I could do these things if I wanted to, but that's not really what it's about. I've never felt like a woman trapped inside a man's body. I think that it's a useful kind of trope. It's got some currency. I think it helps, compact it into a soundbite that people can understand. And I think it probably describes some people's experience with the frequency that they use it. But for me, especially as I got to being a teenager, I was kind of embracing a little bit of the masculine and the feminine, and I was kind of cool with that. So it wasn't a decision to, oh my God, I've got to do this, I've got to become a woman, or I'll die. It was kind of a slide into femaleness. And we're talking about the gender binary. I felt that in order to prosper and to get ahead, I needed to, kind of be one or the other. And I had a little think about it, and I thought, well, it's more the feminine side that I'm going to go down, really. Because as, a transgender person, or as anyone who is transgressing gender norms, you're constantly finding yourself in conflict with society, all the time. And it's just very, very tiring. And I just thought that, being female, I would be happier. And I'm pleased to report that I am. After years of struggle, I'm very happy, very fulfilled. But I can't help wondering sometimes if we lived in a society where there were no repercussions or consequences for being someone who transgresses gender norms, would I have been happy continuing as being quite androgynous? Maybe, who knows? I really don't know. I can't really say that I love being a woman, because that's like saying that I love being British. And I do both, actually. But even though both of these identities are based upon something real and physical, ultimately, my experience is unique as anybody's. My experience of living in Britain and the things that I've seen and what that adds up to me, is personal to me. And I think it's the same as being a woman, really. And so the follow-on from that really is, am I a woman? I'm fully aware that there are people out there that probably wouldn't accept my identity as a woman. I'm aware that there are people that would vociferously, argue that I am and that I should be accepted as a woman. I don't really know. I don't really know what it feels like to be another woman. I don't know what it feels like to be Jane or Naomi or anybody. But I don't know what it feels like to be a man either. And ultimately, how can we possibly know what it feels like to be anybody other than ourselves? But I do know that I'm happier in this body, and expressing myself this way and being accepted as female by other people. And I don't know why that is, and I don't really need to know why. It just is what it is, and I am who I am. So maybe it might be controversial, but I do think that there are physical aspects that inform the way that, we think. I feel calmer now that estrogen and not testosterone is the dominant blood in my bloodstream. Maybe that's just how it affected me. I cry more often. I feel sexual pleasure more evenly through my body and not centered in a certain area. I'm less visually stimulated erotically, so I don't really look at porn anymore. I know that women do, of course, but that's how female hormones changed me. And the reason I talk about that is because now that I don't enjoy porn as much, and there are studies to show that testosterone does make men more visually responsive to pornographic imagery. Now that I'm not as stimulated by that, I'm kind of more critical of it. And I do wonder if I'd never had that enjoyment and never had that testosterone acting on me that helped me enjoy it, would I have been one of those people that was, oh, I don't really like porn? Because I'm kind of moving a bit towards that now. So this is just one of the ways that how I experience my body differently informs the way that I see and view the world. So I've got to wrap it up now, but I did want to talk about some of the things that people say to me now, you know, like, you look better if you put on a bit of weight, Paris, or I wouldn't dress so provocatively, or I think you'd look better with less makeup on. And it's really interesting that everybody now seems to have an opinion on how I should be looking. And if I upload a photo to the internet that doesn't meet their narrow definitions of, you know, how a woman should be presenting herself or how she should look, you know, they let you know. Really, they do. But just to kind of finish off, really, I mean, that's annoying, but what's even more annoying for me is that I'm really enjoying my life more than ever now. Now that I pass as female, largely widely accepted as female, touch wood, there's no wood to touch. I'll probably get called a tranny when I walk out of here. The happiness is tinged with sadness, because when I was 4 on that park bench, I didn't say that I was a woman or even a young woman. I told people that I was a girl. So it's a huge disappointment to have missed out on a female childhood for me. So that's my experience of womanhood, a womanhood without a girlhood. And that for me is what it feels like to be a trans woman.
Thank you. Thanks, Paris. Now, Peter, welcome.
Hello. So, yeah, gender presentation is something that's quite important to me because in sort of Western white capitalist society, it seems to be quite particularly invested in upholding binary genders and suppressing of alternative gender identities and expressions. So for people living outside of culturally recognized genders, it can often be more effective to physically portray what you don't have the language to articulate. So I describe myself as genderqueer, which I understand to simply mean something other than the culturally approved genders of male or female, not necessarily my particular formulation of it. It's sort of more of an umbrella term, this being the closest approximation that's within my frame of reference and would be intelligible to those around me given the context of my class, age, race, location, etc. I also use trans male, not to necessarily say that I identify as a man, but just to say that that's the direction of my gender experience, that I was female assigned at birth and now have somewhat male identification. But another important facet of my identity is my femininity. A lot of people think that trans people have an extremely reductive, regressive idea about gender, that we think, for example, in order to be masculine, you have to be a man, or that we're butchers that go a step further. But in fact, just like non-trans or cisgender people, trans people come in the whole range of gender expressions. So for me, my queer gender and femininity have always been intrinsically linked. So I didn't socially transition in order to be more masculine, but to express my femininity on my own terms, having reconstructed it for myself rather than it feeling like a performance of the default enforced femininity that I felt was expected of me in the past. But it can be very difficult to portray a queer trans male identity if you don't pass as male, and that's compounded by my femininity, because due to cultural androcentrism, whereby masculinity is valued more and femininity is seen as degrading, male items are generally read as more sort of unisex, whereas female ones are seen as only suitable for women. So, for example, trousers are seen as suitable for both, whereas dresses are only for women. So it's hard to be read as trans male whilst not passing and not just be seen as a girl, albeit a sort of queer androgynous kind of a girl. But I think that I generally sort of portray the desired effect by sort of mixing of markers. So wear sort of male marked items such as shirts and ties and brogues and male cuts, and have sort of a male haircut, but show femininity through patterns and colours and use of makeup. So I'm trying to sort of lay a maleness and femininity so they're both visible without it neutralizing into androgyny. And yeah, I think I managed to sort of portray queer gender, but unfortunately, I think this is the case because of the confusion, ridicule, and hostility that I'm sometimes met with. But this experience of living outside of or between genders has afforded me with some interesting insights about the nature of gender dynamics and gives me an opportunity to challenge them, which as a feminist I try to do. So firstly, it gives me just a range of different insights into different people's gendered experiences. So because I have an experience of being read as a man, as a woman, as a masculine female, as a feminine male, I can see how those different groups are treated and what dynamics come into play even over the course of the same interaction. Like it might start out as being read as male and then switches to female, and then I see how the interaction then changes. It also gives me insight, since I've been identifying living as genderqueer, it's given me a strong insight into how fundamentally gendered all interactions are. Like for example, even when I'm being served in a shop, I quite often get somebody say, "Are you a boy or a girl? Are you a boy?" Or, you know, why are you dressed like that, sort of thing. And I thought, like, why is that? Why do they need to know? And I think what they're really saying is, what is the dynamic here and how do I treat you? Which shows that all interactions, however superficial and fleeting, are gendered. So by refusing to engage with that and sort of telling them to mind their own business or something, I sort of raise for them, I hope, the possibility of, you know, make them reflect on why they need to know that and reflect on how they could conduct an interaction in a non-gendered way. It's also my particular experience of gender has afforded me with the opportunity to isolate the determinants of gender and see through some fallacies of gender. So I think if there's quite a lot of alignment between your body, how you're socialized and read, your behavior and presentation, and your self-identity, then it might be quite difficult to disentangle that and see how they influence each other. But as somebody who is medically considered female-bodied, was raised and socialized as female, is feminine, yet still isn't female, it makes me realize that that bodies and behavior, neither of them matter, and has provided me with the liberating realization that the only thing that is fundamentally determining is your intrinsic sense of self. And I think that's something that's relevant for everyone, not just trans or genderqueer people, because I think everyone to an extent feels either limited by the expectations of their gender or feels inadequate if they can't live up to them. So I think it's good for everyone to realize that although your body and behavior might become part of how you understand yourself, it's not in itself determining. But also, I know that patriarchy isn't just about rigid gender roles, and overcoming it isn't just about smashing the gender binary, but it's about rigid gender roles that are based on the idea that femininity and femaleness is lesser, and it's associated with weakness, frivolity, and artificiality, and androcentrism, whereby masculinity, particularly hegemonic masculinity of white, heterosexual, middle-class, cisgender men, is valued the most. So my relationship with androcentrism is slightly more complicated because I do benefit from it to an extent, because whilst I'm feminine, non-passing, I still am somewhat more male than most women are. So I get some of the advantages of that, of being read as a somewhat male, white, middle-class person, and in terms of the respect and safety, things like that. But I'm also challenged by it because whilst I'm overall more male, I'm still, there's a tension, the juxtaposition between the expectation and reality, because I'm expected to be masculine, highlights the apparent failure of masculinity. So when I'm called things like a sissy or a mincer, these slurs aren't just against femininity, but the particular transgression of femininity when you would expect someone to be otherwise. Or another example is I've been laughed at for buying makeup in a shop, had somebody say, "Oh, I hope this isn't for you." So again, it's sort of not just femininity, but a perceived inappropriate femininity. So whilst I don't experience femphobia in the same way as someone living as female, I still have my own particular insights into the devaluing of femininity. So finally, I think I'm in a position to challenge that hegemonic masculinity. Like all dominant groups, it relies on sort of protecting its borders and excluding other people to make its dominance coherent and sort of solidify that hierarchy. So the idea that you can take on a male identity without seeking or getting their approval challenges the ownership of maleness or masculinity of that group. And also gender queerness and gender fluidity suggests that, that you can move in and out of maleness, or there's degrees of maleness is challenging to the idea that maleness is something that's rigid and fixed. And finally, not only do I fail to seek and get permission to access that hegemonic masculinity, but visibly don't even try to seek to emulate it and don't engage with it on their terms, which challenges the idea that hegemonic masculinity is the optimum form that you should aspire to if you want to be accepted as male. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all for amazing panelists, who I'm sure you'll agree have just given us so much food for thought. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I'm just going to start and kick off, ask our panelists a few questions. I mean, I think that the main theme I get from all of the contributions is about how the rigid gender binary doesn't speak to our full experience here, and yet there seems to be such a adherence to it in so many ways in our daily life, which is not comfortable, and it's confusing. And I mean, if I have a question for Naomi, I suppose one of the things I wanted to ask you is, have you ever fantasized about what kind of woman you could present yourself as in a different way than you do now, without the likelihood of being judged?
Well, I don't. Okay, so that's a great question, and as I was listening to all of this, I was thinking about how many times, because I grew up in a very unusual time and place in which people did cross-dress routinely. People did play with gender identity routinely. That was very normative. And so my issue is that I could never cross-dress persuasively. I would have done it all the time if I could, get away with it. But I never found a persuasive way to do that. I don't know what you mean by being judged. I mean, I like the idea of subverting norms and expectations, and I don't have a problem. I like disruption. I've always liked disruption. I mean, to me, I sort of feel like, and I've, written about this, I feel like putting on the trappings of conventional femininity is a costume, and that I'm engaging in a form of theater or a form of costuming. And it's partly to subvert, I mean, I play with it to subvert expectations about what a feminist is, frankly. It's my form of guerrilla theater. I don't take it seriously,
Yeah, thank you. And Campbell, just to sort of follow on from what you were saying about the invisibility of femme lesbians, I have a lot of readers who define themselves as feminine lesbians who say that they are not read as lesbians by other lesbians, in fact. And there's also within the lesbian communities a sense that we have to get beyond the stereotype of the butch lesbian. I don't agree with that. I love lesbians in whatever variety they come in terms of any gender expression, and I think that to me suggests a kind of internalized homophobia because of the kind of inappropriately gendered expression of those of lesbians in some people's eyes. I just wondered what you had to say about that.
Well, if there's a difference between feminine lesbians and self-defined femmes. Self-defined femmes take on a gender identity. They're completely aware of femininity and also subvert dominant heterosexual femininity in their minds and in their desires. That's the main thing. Feminine lesbians might be lesbians who just wear lipstick and wear dresses, and they just think, that's all they do. There's no thought behind it. Specific thought. And what I would say to people who feel they're not recognized as lesbians, assume everybody is a lesbian. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? That's what I do, until proven otherwise, because
Yeah, absolutely.
They can only say no or appear a little bit interested. And the kind of, I think, and I mentioned this in my presentation, there's been a dominance of the representation of feminine lesbianism but it's not ever represented by lesbians a lot of times, and we're being kind of sucked into that mainstream voyeuristic, let's look at the girlies together, which is purely a commercial endeavor. I want to know how we resist that. I think there's room for every single gender in lesbian and bisexual women, you know, and also in transgender people. It's when we start to own that, to take that power for ourselves and not wait to be recognized. How do we signify? Because I know lesbian, bisexual women know how to signal their desire. You know, they know how to signal their desire. They're not backwards in coming forward, and you know, maybe they need a few lessons or something.
I'm sure you'll be on hand to oblige. Paris, you talked about a slide into femaleness and about feeling at a point that there was a drive to be one or the other. And I was just wondering, you know, why is it that a lot of people seem to be so uncomfortable with anything that does fall outside the binary?
I think because we like to know where we are with people, don't we? And I think that, you know, there is evidence to show that people's brains are hardwired to think of things in terms of binaries, and I think that we do, and it's so entrenched, and I think that it's such a fundamental thing. You know, you look at somebody walking down the street, well, not so much now, but I used to look at people, you don't even register it, it's just either they're man or woman, you know, and your brain just does it for you like that. And I think anything that disrupts that, really, it just leaves, you know, really, people find it really unsettling, because if you don't even know that, such a basic thing, you know, that your brain should be able to just work out for you without even thinking, I think people just find it really unsettling. So I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I do think actually that trans is the new punk, and I've said this before, and it shouldn't be. You know, I mean, we spoke to. We were at the Creative Diversity Awards, Television Awards, and this guy had produced this really wonderful documentary about old people's homes and people being abused in homes, and they'd uncovered it, and you know, lots of good stuff had come out of it, and I think it was Panorama or Horizon, something like that. No, it was the BBC, so I think it was Panorama, yeah. So we went over and said hello to him and said, hi, this is what we do, you know, congratulations on the awards. We're trying to improve the way that transgender people are presented in the media. What advice would you have for us? And he said, and he's been really, really genuine in trying to help. You can see his brain going, he's like, yeah, that's probably late night, Channel 4, BBC 3, you know, kind of teenage pregnancy, drug addiction, it's kind of in that taboo kind of slot. And I just thought, well, am I taboo? Is it taboo for me to be here today talking to you? But people see it as something that's really dangerous and scary and disruptive. And I think I'm with Naomi on that, really. I think any kind of anarchism is probably a good thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, more for that revolution. Peter, just finally, and then I'm afraid we have to wrap up. There's something else going on here afterwards. But to what extent do you feel that you can make use of male privilege when you pass as male? And do you think that destabilising gender is a desirable means of overcoming gender inequality?
Well, is this working? Yeah. I just wanted to say that you know, my gender identity isn't something that's just done strategically to sort of make a political point, in the same way as it's not done to sort of strategically gain privilege. But I think just as it is what it is, I might as well sort of take advantage of the particular experiences of gender that affords me, and use them to sort of prompt people to question things. And of course, I'm not trying to say that that my experience is sort of like uniquely sort of radical or something like that. I'm just saying it's one experience, and they're all, anyone that's doing something that's sort of disrupting people's ideas about oppressive gender norms is part of that, and mine sort of one part of that, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank all of our panelists, because unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up. I think today we've talked very much about gender being on a spectrum, about how the binary doesn't speak to our full experience, and it seems to be like a question about language, about an openness to a multiplicity of selves, if you like, and expressions. And perhaps if we can take that away from today's talk and think on it and act on it in our lives, perhaps we can create the kind of more open society that we really want to live in and works for everybody. Thanks very much, everyone. By the way, if you want to come and get a copy of DIVA with Naomi on the cover, please feel free. We've got about 30 copies here.